Good day everyone, Greg Satilla here from CRPG Legends, and today I want to talk about the difference between World of Warcraft Classic and the period it is trying to emulate, which is Vanilla Era World of Warcraft. But I don't want to solely focus on the technical changes to the game, rather I want to talk about how both the player base and the environment that the World of Warcraft Classic was released into would ultimately prevent players old or new from being able to repeat that true vanilla experience. Even if we would have received the exact game that was released in the vanilla era, there is no way players were going to have the same experience. World of Warcraft Classic was never going to be World of Warcraft Vanilla. Now, one of the interesting things about the world today and how we share information so quickly is that as time passes after the release of a video game, the environment around that game is going to change very quickly. If you can't beat a boss on release day of a new video game, you might have to keep trying and really work to figure out what to do. If you buy the game on day 30 and can't beat the same boss, chances are there are online guides, YouTube videos, and a lot of other resources to help you figure out what to do. Maybe you overlooked a valuable piece of information earlier in the game. The gaming community has become pretty organized. We have become very good at figuring out how to min-max games and how to get that information out there. Of course, these same concepts can be applied to World of Warcraft Classic. The player base the game was released to was a lot more knowledgeable about the systems in place within the game and how they work. This was not the re-release of some dead game. No, this was allowing players of what is currently still the most active MMO in the world to relive where the game first started. WoW has been around for so long that you can have played for over a decade and never experienced the vanilla era. As a result, the game is not a mystery anymore like it was in the vanilla era. The game has comprehensive guides breaking down all aspects of nearly every iteration of the game. The demand for this game was fueled by the most ardent fans. World of Warcraft Classic was not going to be a game of naivety and failure. It was going to be a game of min-maxing and raiding due to the player base and the environment the game was being released into. The people who were most excited to play Classic and composed a large portion of the player base were players who played Vanilla originally and did not accomplish their goals of raiding throughout the entire content. Others were veterans of World of Warcraft that started after the Vanilla era and wanted to experience an era that they had only heard spoken of before. So let's review some of the major forces that resulted in WoW Classic ultimately being a very different experience than Vanilla, which were player knowledge, the changes in how we form online communities, and the technological changes that have occurred outside the game between Vanilla and Classic, and why in some ways these changes have been both good and bad for the overall game. I want to talk about how the single biggest influence on the changes to World of Warcraft Classic from Vanilla is the accumulated knowledge of its player base and how the environments online and in-game allow us to share that knowledge and experience in a much more efficient way, and as a result, an era like the one that existed during Vanilla Warcraft is virtually impossible to recreate, and that in most cases is definitely not a bad thing, depending on what you're looking to get out of the game. It's probably best to compare my experience with both versions of the game and how it has changed over the years in order to show you what I mean. Let's start at the beginning with how many of us got into World of Warcraft originally. I personally wanted to try an MMO, and I went out and bought Final Fantasy XI, installed it, and didn't really like its interface or how it looked, and didn't really play it much. The next day, I went back to the store and bought World of Warcraft. I figured I would give it a whirl. I didn't mind the original Warcraft games, and I loved the Diablo series. So I picked it up and started a character and began to dabble in the game world. I didn't really understand the game that much. I mean, it looked better and had a better interface than Final Fantasy, but I didn't really understand how the game actually worked at all. I was a Night Elf warrior. I leveled my way through the early part of the game, dying often and really not understanding the fundamentals as the game did a really bad job of teaching you things. I eventually ended up in a dungeon with 4 other players, and I had no idea of the concept of tanks and DPS and healers. It was a game of failure. You figured stuff out dying over and over again as you went. I was lucky enough to have a roommate who had played a lot of EverQuest to teach me the basic fundamentals of an MMO over time. So I started a new character after that first dungeon. I left the Alliance and joined the Horde as a rogue and made my way to level 60 over weeks and months, and the failure was far from over. Fast forward to the release of WoW Classic in 2019. The amount of ways players could prepare themselves for the experience before the game was even released was incredible. You could play the current retail World of Warcraft if you weren't already. Many players were experimenting with private servers, trying to get a feel for the vanilla era. We had massive websites like Wowhead and Icy Veins with guides explaining all aspects of the game before it was even released. Guides based on both years of experimentation on private servers and data that had been collected initially during vanilla and during the beta. Players were going in with plans on how they were going to level to 60. Many had booked time off work to dedicate to the initial push to 60. WoW's sphere of influence was so big over the years that even if you had never played World of Warcraft before, you probably were familiar with the concepts of group play and MMORPG mechanics at some point if you were a gamer in 2019. Before the game even launched, players could easily look up their pre-bis lists for all classes and specs, as well as talent specialization for both leveling and raiding. Players were planned and prepared to be ready for the first Molten Core run as soon as they could be. Players organized themselves into little groups to jump back into the game together with old friends and old guildmates. They weren't starting the game alone and naive, and having the majority of the player base already in this position would ultimately change the experience for any new players that were playing World of Warcraft for the first time with Classic. Player knowledge also greatly changed the leveling experience. In Classic and Vanilla, leveling is a huge, inefficient grind to get to 60. Quest givers and objectives are not marked on your map, and a lot of the objectives could be vague in where you would have to go to achieve them. Now, in the Vanilla era, there wasn't much of a solution to this. Databases were starting to be developed, and sites like Thoughtbot were starting to pop up, but that definitely took some time to get going. For the most part, you wandered around a zone searching aimlessly for quest objectives along the way, often not knowing when you had exhausted the quest in the zone or if you were even in the right zone to begin with, other than trying to find enemies your own level. You got by mainly asking other players for information. The only add-on that I really had that helped me initially was one that allowed me to see coordinates on my map, so I could use the coordinates that players were giving others in Thoughtbot. In Classic era, right out of the gate I had Questy, and soon after I had Guideline, both absolutely game-changing add-ons. Questy marking quest givers on your map and quest objectives, and Guideline basically giving you options to download different guides that act like checklists that walk you through the leveling experience. Both take the guesswork out of leveling and are dominant in the community. If you didn't want to be left behind the curve, you needed add-ons like this in order to keep up with the min-max attitude of the majority of the community. Leveling was seen as a barrier to the real content, getting to level 60 and acquiring loot and making your character the best it could be. Some players used their knowledge of classic mechanics and focused on running certain instances repeatedly in groups in order to maximize their experience per hour and level as efficiently as they could. Anything to hit that level cap and start gearing, a completely different mindset than the one in Vanilla. In Vanilla, you spent your time figuring out the game and exploring this new world, whereas in Classic, you weren't amazed as zones blended seamlessly into one another and you discovered a whole new ecosystem. You just carved your path through. As I mentioned earlier, it took me months to level my first character to 60. My Classic character was done in just over 2 weeks. My character was in Prebis and raiding Molten Core before my Vanilla character would have done his first Alderman. The next part was finding a guild and starting the end game content, doing the high level dungeons and preparing for that first raid. Once again, there was no way to emulate the clumsy experience of Vanilla anymore. In Vanilla, you kinda just seem to end up in a guild, probably as a result of running into another random guilded player and helping each other out. You were probably unaware of the concept of 40-man raiding in the first place, and you just want to run some dungeons. Most of your knowledge about the game for the next while was probably going to come from the members of your guild, so you hoped you rolled the dice and picked a good one. This part has not changed. Initially, when I started to do the endgame content, the final dungeons of the game were raidable, initially with 40 people if you wanted, but when I hit 60, you did Skolo and Strat with 10 players, and UBRS with 15. That was my only concept of raiding at first. You started to hear about Molten Core, but you heard it took 40 players to do it. Maybe you got into a guild that was trying to put together 40 people to try Molten Core. You heard that there were guilds out there that were going to organize weekly raids to Molten Core multiple times a week to get epic quality loot, but those guilds only wanted players with blue gear. Either way, you put together what you think is your best gear to go into Molten Core. Obviously, your class has its own specific set that gives you bonuses you can get out of the dungeons. That must be the best. So that's the gear you put together. You look online, but no one has a real understanding of what gear is good, just arguments on forum posts. Eventually, the elitist jerks forums would become more widely known, but even then, that was a minority of the players. So you put together your dungeon set and you were ready to go into Molten Core. Well, let's look at how this process played out in Classic. First of all, I knew I wanted to raid straight through to the end of Nax going in. So did many others, and everyone was claiming their guild was going to do it. How did you get yourself into the right guild? How do you last? I personally came into the game with a small group of friends, and a few of us split up and looked for different guilds, grouping with different players before trying out their guilds. Initially, I didn't have much luck. Guilds were imploding left and right, or were clearly not going to make it. Even if the members were friendly and fun to play with, you knew they weren't going to back up their claims of being the most dominant guild on the server. My friend said he found a good group of players that were organized and funny and not too big of jerks, and he thought we would fit in, and honestly, it couldn't have worked out any better. A majority of the players that walked into Molten Core together for their first raid made it all the way through the game to finish Kel'Thuzad in Phase 6. But I digress. Once we found our guild, we had to get our previs and be ready to raid in Molten Core by the first Tuesday of October. And no class in the game was going to assemble their dungeon set as their previs, except a select group of rogues. Now, while in vanilla, there was really not a lot of information on the gear you were supposed to wear. This was very different in the Classic era. Both Wowhead and Icy Veins had extensive guides on pre-bis and bis items through every phase of the game. Now, a Wowhead and Icy Veins pre-bis lists are based on a lot of theory crafting, and I just want to take a quick look at the difference between what some of the average players were wearing as they first attempted to go into Molten Core in vanilla versus what the average player was wearing going into MC in Classic. Let's take a look at the priests first and look at the stats on their devout dungeon set and compare that to the stats of the items off of their pre-bis list I found on one of the many random sites that include this information. Devout has 134 int, 71 stam, 115 spirit, and you get a plus 23 healing as a set bonus, as opposed to the pre-bis list, which doesn't emphasize the base stats, instead pushing plus healing to a much greater degree. 77 int, 52 stam, 39 spirit, plus 223 healing, and 6 mana per 5. Obviously, what we are seeing is that the community has found that plus healing is a far more beneficial stat for priests going into raid content, and their dungeon set doesn't include any plus healing other than a set bonus. This is pretty prevalent throughout the dungeon sets. They are all very bad in comparison to a lot of the other gear available in the game. It definitely left players confused on how itemization works and how to prioritize their stats on their gear. There is no real confusion anymore. There are well-written, well-organized guides out there for every class. What stats are basically mandatory in the game to have, the hit percentage that classes need to be at to hit the cap on their special attacks. There are guides that tell you how to spec and what your spell rotation should be. It's all been figured out, and if you don't go searching it, Some other player in the game is probably just going to tell you. If your gear is completely against the meta or your spell rotation is off, someone is going to mention it to you. If you try to go into MC and tank in a full Valor set, someone is going to say something. Finally, we actually got around to entering Molten Core. My first experience in Molten Core, we wiped several times on the giants at the start of the raid. Definitely wiped to the lava spawns and core hounds as well before we eventually made it to Lucifron, where we proceeded to wipe for another hour or so before calling it quits. We didn't have any mods, we weren't itemized properly, raid frames weren't what they are now, so you had no timers telling you when curses were going out, you didn't have debuffs on your raid frames, there were no threat meters, you didn't have the raid icons, it was pure chaos. But really the biggest issue was players didn't have experience leading raids nor running them. They didn't have the knowledge and experience to properly play their classes or understand the real dynamics of the game or working as a group. It wasn't like a 5-man. You couldn't easily pick out the guy who was pulling threat when 20 spells were landing while your tank was running in. People didn't go to MC to wipe, they just didn't know what they were doing yet. It was a fundamental problem that took time for players to learn. It took guilds months to get through Molten Core. You could probably make some good montages of guilds getting slowly better over that time. But even while we figured out how to work together and eventually get better as a group, we still remained poorly optimized throughout raiding, and we still had to do things differently without a lot of the mods. We had players dedicated to running stopwatches and timers to let us know when in-game mechanics were coming. We used to have to guess a lot about threat during threat-sensitive fights like Ragnaros and Vale. They were wild and unpredictable. We wiped on Vale for weeks. We would have to set the fight up so no DPS at the start while the tank generated threat. The first off-tank would come in next, followed a few seconds later by the second off-tank before the DPS was allowed to start. Tanks were also itemized to take hits, not generate threat. This process took a long time to fine-tune before we eventually got it down. Let's compare that to my experience in Classic. We set a hard start date for raiding as a guild, but we also organized some voluntary reputation trash clearing runs in MC to get rep with the Hydraxian Waterlords to ensure we could do Ragnaros on our first week of raiding. Well, on our first rep run with about 30 some people in blues, we did all of MC up to Golemag on a practice night. When we started officially raiding, people were using consumables. They had the best gear on they could have without raiding, and they had experience raiding. Most of it on far more complex fights that were introduced later in the game's life cycle. It was no comparison. We were doing more damage than my Blackwing Lair guild did in vanilla before we even really got started. We have threat meters, we have boss mods with timers for each boss, we have raid frames that highlight debuffs that your class can clear off players, and most importantly, we have experienced players that know how the game works. In vanilla, going into Nax, I believe on my server we had one guild that had managed to kill Cthulhu. In Classic, our server had over 130 guilds that had cleared Cthulhu before Nax was released. It's a crazy difference. The knowledge of how the game played and how it was to be rolled out made a huge difference on the economy as well, as players went in vying to corner the market on key resources, and they knew which materials would become more valuable for each phase of the game. This, in conjunction with the increased player base on servers being 4 to 5 times larger than it was, a much higher percentage of raiders in the world, and the increase in bots, has led to a much higher level of inflation than we ever saw in vanilla. Because so much of the player base is raiders looking to min-max, the market for raid items took off, as flasks, potions, and elixirs skyrocketed in price, along with all their base level herbs. If you needed it to raid, it is not going to be cheap. It has resulted in the player base trying to reach out and establish new ways to generate gold to keep up. I definitely acknowledge there are plenty of ways that the economy has been affected to far greater degrees in Classic beyond just the player's knowledge base, and the rise in gold farming and selling is definitely the largest reason. The rise in inflation does mean that players wanting not to be left behind have to actively take part in the buying and selling process in order to generate the amount of income they need. Selling to vendors is not going to cut it with the level of inflation that has already incurred in the game. Of course, the rise in inflation feeds into itself with the rampant gold buying that a good portion of the player base does in order to bypass either the gearing or the farming part of the game. It has become rampant in World of Warcraft Classic, and it puts a lot of pressure on average gamers who might not be able to float by on the money they had accumulated so far, as the inflation towards the end of Phase 5 and the beginning of Phase 6 became rampant due to the increased requirement to have consumables to successfully raid Nax. Compare this to vanilla, where my epic mount was my only real big cost sink. 1,000 gold was a lot of money in vanilla. I never really had much of a need to constantly farm gold. Consumables weren't very expensive, and the world was much easier to farm with less players and less experienced players. I have other videos you can check out where I talk about the impact of gold farming and the price of consumables in Phase 6 of Classic. Next, I want to touch upon the difference between community in both eras, because the way servers and guilds organize and come together has completely changed the game. In vanilla, players mainly communicated within their guilds through guild forums, third-party voice chat, and in-game chat. If you wanted to communicate with the community, there was the WoW forums, which were always buzzing, but they weren't a great source for communicating quickly. But to be fair, it wasn't a very organized community overall. Maybe a few inter-guild PvP groups which would form to grind High Warlord or something, but most communities didn't seem to go much further, at least not on a mid-tier server like I was on. Also, in vanilla, people were getting a feel for the game, and the meta of the game was pretty fragmented. It was a different kind of social experience. Many people played the game with no objective in mind other than to have fun and explore the world with friends. These days, the majority of the player base is goal-oriented, and they came to WoW Classic to raid. Having a strong, like-minded player base is good for those that want to play the game that way, but the players who might want to play with no clear objective or without that min-max philosophy might struggle finding their place within WoW Classic, although it is definitely not impossible by any means. Also in Classic, Discord made a bigger impact than I think people realize. It has allowed servers to come together and communicate and work together better than ever before. The world buff meta doesn't work without these tools. Our server has organized, scheduled world buffs going throughout the day, every day. People work hard to get this stuff done, and Discord is how we organize it. These days, many players are in buff jail on their main characters and aren't logged into the game on their main characters until raid time. But Discord allows players to retain that sense of community. I don't think I would feel close to my guild without the constant Discord chatter that keeps us together when we aren't in game and comes with you in your pocket when you aren't at your computer. It allowed our server to organize PvP groups, it allowed better trade to go on, and it allowed people to be able to share their content with one another more easily. The other unique thing about Classic versus Vanilla is that the Vanilla community formed slowly over time, with people trickling in more and more as time went on. In Classic, so many people were ready to go from the start, so many people dumped into the game on day one together, and not the smaller populations you saw on servers before. No, Classic had 4 to 5 times as many players on the new Classic servers. Communities got to know strong personalities very fast as everything began to sort itself out. People figured out their roles within the community we created over time. It was far different than in vanilla. We have summoning services for Dire Maul, Songflower, and ZG buffs. Players sell cleared Dire Maul tribute runs. People sell boosting services. Stuff like this did not exist during vanilla. It's really incredible the amount of changes to the game brought forward by need due to the min-max meta. The hardware that we play the game on has changed dramatically. I have always had a good PC for the time while WoW was out, but internet connections and hardware have changed dramatically still between vanilla and classic. There is no comparison. I played WoW Classic at 144 frames per second in widescreen at 1440p these days with a 1 gigabit per second internet connection. In vanilla, I played WoW at a much lower frame rate in 1024 by 768 with probably a 5 megabit internet connection. There was much more lag, the game slowed down more, players were less responsive as a result, internet connections would drop out. It made a huge difference to the game. Players are able to respond to things much quicker these days, and we have much more screen space to put our add-ons on with widescreen displays. Players are just able to respond to changes in the environment quicker and with less issues these days, unless you take some batch damage. It is clear that changes in hardware has made a huge difference to the game experience. Now, I know there are some major changes to the experience as a result of the game's classes starting out their place in history after they had all their class overhauls done in order to have more balance in the game. Same with raid tuning. Cthulhu didn't come into the game unkillable like in vanilla, and a lot of exploits were fixed. I will argue though that if they let things progress on a patch by patch basis, it wouldn't have made the experience any closer to vanilla Warcraft. It was never going to happen. We were never going to get that same game again, even if we got the exact same game in every way delivered to us as we did in the vanilla era. The players know too much. The community would have had guides and specs and gear for every phase of the way, and players would be jumping through hoops trying to keep up. It probably would have been further away from the vanilla experience, as people would be prepared in advance to exploit the power variance through patch after patch. In the end, I want to say, although some of the changes are frustrating and challenging at the same time, I have really enjoyed my WoW Classic experience, much more than my WoW Vanilla experience. I wouldn't change my WoW Vanilla experience at all. I made a lot of friends, I became passionate about a new hobby, and I had fun, and I built off that experience to become a better Warcraft player. However, my classic journey has been one that has been full of success. I once again made good friends and reunited with old friends. However, this time around, I defeated all the bosses that got the best of me and got the loot I wanted so badly in vanilla. I look forward every week to pushing each week to be better and faster than the week before and to have fun with a good group of people. It has been a great time. WoW Classic is not WoW Vanilla, and it wasn't going to be, but for someone like me, I got exactly what I wanted. I got a player base excited to raid, that was goal focused and willing to min-max and dedicate the time to be successful. This wasn't because the game was released with 1.13 classes or because the raid frames were better. It was because the community pulled together with their collective knowledge and resources, and we were going to blast our way through whichever version of Classic WoW they put before us. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please check out my other content. I stream regularly on Twitch. I also have my website you can check out. There is also my Patreon you can also check out as well. So until next time, thank you very much. Please click the like and subscribe buttons if you enjoy this content. I enjoy making it, and I hope there will be more soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.